Right, I think people are starting to file in now. Looking pretty good. So let's get started. We are just a couple minutes behind here. But yeah, welcome everyone to today's Foresight Fireside Chat. This is the final one of 2021. So we're super excited to have you here today. We'll be covering the topic of non-dilutive funding. It's an interesting topic, and here today we have Elliot Moore from CoPoint. He's an expert on SHRED, and he's going to be able to do a deep dive with us today on that topic. And we also have Susan Blanchette, who's with Origin Air. You might recognize her from Foresight's programs. And she's here today to give us her story with non-dilutive funding, discuss some of her successes, some of her mistakes, and just generally go through some of the non-dilutive funding mechanisms that are out there. So I think we have a really great panel here today. We also have James Chapaya, who, if you've been tuning along for this series, you probably know him well by now. He works here with us at Foresight. His extensive background in finance means that he is knowledgeable on just about everything. So we're super happy to have him here today. And as before, he's been a fantastic moderator. So before I turn things over for today, I do just want to reiterate that the Fireside Chats are a conversation. So we encourage your participation, your questions. No question is a bad question, because you never know who else is also having those same questions. So feel free to throw everything in the Q&A box. It is a little bit different than the chat box. It's down here. I hope everyone's layout is all the same. It's down here on the very bottom. It says Q&A. Please put your questions in there, because it helps us address them kind of more regularly, and we'll address them as diligently as we can. That's it for me. I will pass it over to James. Thank you so much, and take it away.
Thanks, Tyler. Welcome, everybody. Yes, anybody that knows me does know that I know everything. Just ask, I'll tell you. So just kidding. It's great to have Susan and Elliot here with us today. The real focus here is on non-dilutive. We were going to try and cover as much as we possibly can in our time frame. We're going to let them just talk for the first half of this, but do not hesitate to put questions in as we're going, and we can address them either directly or on the answering it to everybody to fill it in. So just use that, please. And we're going to save the second half really for real open discussion and using the Q&A to help guide where you're looking for information. So going to turn it over to which one of you guys wants to go first?
Oh, Susan goes first.
Okay, I don't mind. So I'll just give a very quick share of my screen, just anyone who doesn't know who I am and who my company is, Origin Air. I do see lots of familiar faces on there, but just a really quick overview. We are solving indoor air pollution problems. With respect to that, we make a purifier that an air purifier with genetically modified plants. Sorry, this is live pilot at University of Victoria. Air goes through a traditional HEPA filter and then goes through our plants. So science, development, R&D, you'll hear a bit about SHRED later on from Elliot, but there's a ton of different grants that we can go for, and non-dilutive funding based on what we're developing. This is our new product, the Pinnacle. Customer discovery, also important on new non-dilutive grants, like all these things that play in. Patents, important for non-dilutive grants. We've patented the plants and registered in 6 countries. All of these things play a role in what you can achieve through being in Canada. There's a lot of money that you can tap into. We've brought almost $1 million in non-dilutive funding into our company. And this is basically what it does. So we have traditional premium HEPA filters, volatile organic compounds are removed by our genetically bioengineered plants, and we produce clean oxygen. So that's just a really brief overview of what Originaire does. But I know this talk today is on non-dilutive funding. So to give a really brief overview of what I want to tell you is just a bit about my journey with non-dilutive. Incorporated the company mid-2019, and I'll talk about this more later, but straight out the gates applied for Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Not the right order. So about mistakes, I had a list of grants and non-dilutive funding on my wall the first year. I came from 15 years as a lawyer. I was like, oh yeah, I could just walk in, write this grant, get it. No, there's a specific order that every day you're still learning and still iterating on. We haven't cracked the SDTC funding yet. We've actually been denied 4 times by Sustainable Development Technology Canada, but there are so many other pots that you can jump into. And as an entrepreneur, the biggest point I want to get across is that list on my wall that was like 90% red, which is no's the first year, turned to about 40% green the second year. And we're just heading into our third year. And I think we'll probably get to about 60%, but you really need to have a thick skin. You're going to get more no's than yeses when you start off, and just don't be discouraged. I think we'll hear the same thing from James on dilutive funding. You know, people want to see you improve. So if you get a no, just keep going, because the next time you might get a yes. And if not, maybe the 4th time, maybe the 5th time you'll get a yes. It's about persistence and resiliency. So I'll let Elliot introduce himself, and then we can dive into a bit more on non-dilutive grants. Nice to see everyone.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, thanks so much to everybody for having us here today. Great to be on panel with you, Susan, and thanks James and Tyler for facilitating. So yeah, so I'm Elliot Moore. I'm an executive VP ex CoPoint. That name may not be familiar to you. We actually just rebranded after 27 years of our old name. We used to be called TSGI. Which everybody called like TGIF and stuff. So we rebranded to CoPoint, which is hopefully a little more memorable. So if that name is not super familiar to you, you're probably not the only one. So yeah, so we are a dedicated shred consulting company based here in Calgary. But we work with companies all across Western Canada predominantly, and we have a few companies we work with in Ontario and Quebec. So obviously, you know, COVID has thrown a bit of a curveball to a lot of companies. In some ways, though, it has made it more realistic to work with companies outside of, you know, Alberta and Western Canada. We do love to go see our clients visiting in person in BC and Saskatchewan stuff. That's not out of the norm for us. But yeah, so anyways, we work exclusively in the area of shred, which is why it's great to, you know, have folks like Susan who can handle more of their specialties on the grant side of things. So yeah, just a very quick overview. We've been in business for 27 years. We've got a dedicated team of CPAs, accountants, as well as an equal-sized team of scientists and engineers. And basically, our whole reason for being is that the shred program is a fairly burdensome process sometimes to go through, and our team basically offloads all of that work that's involved with applying for and defending a claim if it gets audited. So basically, it allows our clients to focus basically exclusively on what they do best, which is, you know, innovating and developing their technology and running their business. And they can kind of basically have us shoulder that process and basically build that rapport with the CRA auditors and get their claims through unscathed. Yeah, and offer a lot of strategy and upfront advice to make sure that the claims are as big as possible and get through an audit without any adjustments. So that's us. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into the details, and happy to answer any questions on shred, how it works, tips and tricks, things like that. Oh, James,
just take me off my mute. Okay, so one of the things I want to get into, so non-dilutive funding is obviously a big deal from equity investors' perspectives. They want to see taking advantage of as much non-dilutive. In the past, we've seen situations where companies will, like, what I've been finding interesting is investors will say, well, you need to move to the US or change your head office to the US to gain access to capital, equity capital. But obviously that's going to throw a wrench into the non-dilutive side. And so now we're seeing investors going, hang on for a second. If we do that, we're losing access to potentially to some of these things. Now, you can still get SHRED if you're not Canadian, but it does change in its nature. And I wonder if you want to touch on that aspect of what does it mean to, if you're for a lot of the companies that we have on here are CCPCs. So really important from a CRA perspective, but as you transition to who's investing in you or where your head office is, what does that do, and what should the companies be aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually just had a company approach us yesterday about this exact question because they're looking at changing their structure. So yeah, so the biggest thing that you mentioned an acronym there. For anyone who doesn't know, the acronym CCPC stands for Canadian Controlled Private Corporation. And if you break it down, it's exactly what the name implies. Basically, your company is controlled by people who are Canadians. But that has two different factors to it. One is basically the official stuff on paper, which is like who actually has controlling shares in the company. So if the majority is controlled, so more like 50% plus one is controlled by Canadians, that's considered a Canadian controlled company. However, you also need to look at some of the realities of things like who sits on your board. So if you look at the company, the shares may be controlled by majority controlled by Canadians, but if the person who's actually like making decisions, like a chairman of the board or someone who has more board seats than more Canadians or more non-Canadians hold board seats than others, it could take that CCPC status and throw it into question. So the CRA does have the ability to look at the CCPC status from a couple of different angles. And I'm probably missing, and there are many other kind of smaller caveats, but those are the big ones. So those are the things you need to look out for. So when you are looking for investments and potentially, a American-based venture firm or basically some investors from the States are looking to invest significantly in your company, and that actually tips you guys over the scales so that you're not a Canadian-controlled private corp, it can have a really big impact on SHRED. And the biggest thing is probably for everybody who's on this call today, it's probably at the federal level. So at the federal level for SHRED, I should just clarify, the federal government offers a base level of a base program called SHRED, Scientific Research Experimental Development. Most of the provinces then have their own versions of the program that are layered on top, and those go by different names. So in Alberta, I'll start with BC and Saskatchewan. Both of those are called the respective like BC SHRED tax credit. In Alberta, though, it's known as the Innovation Employment Grant. Don't let the name, the word grant throw you off. It's still a SHRED program, but those all layer on top of the federal program. And for a lot of the companies on the call today, if you guys are CCPCs, you are attracting the highest rate of SHRED from the federal government, which is 35% refundable, which means that if you don't have taxes owing, the SHRED program basically delivers you a benefit that is a check that just gets sent to you. Now, if your CCPC status gets called into question, or if you're no longer a CCPC, you go from 35% to 15%. And the other key difference is that when you go from 35 to 15, it is actually no longer refundable. It becomes just a tax credit, which can only be used against federal taxes. So those are some key considerations just to keep in mind. There are some nuances. So if you are in a situation where you have questions about your CCPC status, we're happy to have a chat and take a look at it. But yeah, definitely something you want to consider because it's a significant, it's a game changer for you if you do change that from refundable to non-refundable, and basically less than half of what you get back otherwise.
That's a huge impact because you're no longer getting cash. You're getting, and from the perspective of most of the companies, they're not going to be taxable anyway. So you're basically losing out effectively 100% of what you're getting. That just hurt. So from an investor's, if you're looking from an equity investor's perspective, they're going, if we can leverage our money and have access to that, that's a big deal. That's cool. That's actually super important. Susan, I want to get into something you were talking about, because it's actually quite interesting. You did pick the hardest one to go for, which is kind of funny. And that means it's like, yeah, there's a lot of heavy lifting that's involved in that. But you talked about how you were able to switch from, you know, a really high failure rate to start moving to the other direction. I think what would be really interesting is what did you see were key elements that enabled you to make that move, where they looked at you differently, where you started turning the no's into yeses?
First, on the shred point, I want to just, from a practical perspective of a company owner, set up a process. You know, get your projects down, have all your shred employees or technical employees, like their hours have to go in every day onto which project they're working from. Do it in advance rather than at the end. It makes your life much easier to get that money back, because that's a really nice pot as well. I think our shred return this year is about 80,000, and it's going to be more for 2021. It's super important to get that check coming back in. So how I figured out, there is a way, there's a specific roadmap of how you get funds, and it varies if you're clean tech or something else, but I know the majority of people in Foresight are clean tech companies. So what you need to do is you need to go to a MyTax or NRC IRAP first. That's like a very key step. Get into NRC IRAP, get your ITA assigned to you. That would be my number one recommendation right off the hop. Those people will help you, and they are there for early stage. We received, you know, in the beginning, just smaller amounts, 20,000 for a youth employment program, but that covers 100% of an employee. And then they've upped that to 36,000, but they assign the money 4 months early. So there's all these little steps you have to figure out and plan out a roadmap. That moves to a project, and we received a $50,000 project, and now we've recently received a very large project from NRC IRAP. So it does involve time. A lot of time is involved, but there's ways to get your ducks in a row. Another one that we did really early on was MyTax. MyTax will cover 50 to 75% of your employees' cost, and then you have to work with the university. So it's a really educating yourself. Like, then there's NSERC, then there's Innovate BC. They're all different little pots you can grab money from. Innovation Asset Collective, another really important one if you haven't heard about it. It involves a large buy-in of $15,000 to become a member, but the benefits are extraordinary, especially for female founders. In March, they're giving out 50,000 in grants towards your IP portfolio. So another, like the first time we got denied from SDT, or the first time I applied for the right SDTC fund and we got denied, it was because they told us to get in-house IP. So I had this incredible license, global exclusive to our genetically engineered plants. And I even am a lawyer, and I was like, okay, I got the best IP, I'm good. No, you need in-house IP. You need to be building a portfolio. You need a plan that results in an exit. You need an IP strategy, but IAC, you pay 15,000 to get in, but you get that back. You get 15,000 in legal fees, they will pay your lawyer for you. So there's all these little tricks, tons of grants for people. Human resources, I've got every single one of my staff covered, either 100% or 80% by NRC IRAP, which is then the last 15% covered by SHRED. So it's kind of like math. So if you like math, you'll like grants. But so many different little pots of money that I'm happy to share with anyone in an email. PS4Y, Innovate BC, NSERC, Engage. And there's a way you have to do them. Like I've applied for Innovate BC twice and been denied, because you have to do the stepping stones. You have to do NRC IRAP or MyTax first. Then the other ones, they all talk to each other. Then they'll be like, oh, they've done that. Now maybe they can do this one. So I could go on for a really long time, but there's definitely a process you need to follow.
What was the name of that pay-in program?
The Innovation
15,000?
Asset Collective, yes.
Okay. Yeah,
that,
it's actually now been put in the chat.
yes, it's in the chat. And that's the other thing, you'll find kind of supporters in different programs. So Innovation Asset Collective has just been, I think because we got in really early, the program just started and they've been tasked, I think it's 400 million program to support the development of intellectual property in Canada. So then they've also been tasked to support female founders in the next fiscal coming up. But it's important to get in with those supporters. Another area I've had a lot of support is the Trade Commissioner Service. There's certain places that they're just there to help you. Like Trade Commissioner Service is there. All they want to do is help you as much as possible. So we just found out last night we were chosen for the Women in Clean Tech mission to Palo Alto, to Silicon Valley. Like a week ago, I got denied for SDTC, and it was just like, you can't let that get you down. Because then a week later, I'm like, wow, so it's a big wins, peaks and valleys, and just don't get discouraged. Keep applying, and it eventually becomes this roller coaster that moves along, and you start getting traction.
Thanks for that, Susan. Elliot, I got a question for you. And then I'm going to caveat this because we actually do pay you and my other company for this. But so why would somebody pay you to put together their shred claim? And I actually, by the way, I know you've actually answered this in the past in a previous presentation. So it's a topic that, yes, I do understand. You got the question probably canned already, but I really think this is an important aspect of process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, happy to address that. Also, just after that, I'll just also answer the question from Andrea about the interaction between those programs with Shred too. So we'll make sure to get that too. I think what it comes down to is just specialization of just people doing what they do best. So for a company, a technology company that is going through Shred once a year, the process, there's a lot of nuances and intricacies to the program that you might get like kind of the low-hanging fruit. But what our team does is, because we work with more than 150 companies, mostly in Alberta, but in Western Canada. And because of that, we have a ton of experience going through claims of companies that are sometimes doing similar things, because you can kind of reinvent the wheel. You can claim stuff to get to the same technology or outcome or solution that another company has already developed. So we work with a lot of companies that are working on sometimes similar things, and we take that expertise and leverage it to other similar companies. So we might do a claim where we're working with a helium or a lithium company, and we understand a recent stance, and we've taken a recent strategy or approach, and it's actually gone through audit, and we've basically tested and verified that approach is acceptable to CRA. And so we have very up to the minute kind of knowledge and expertise on where CRA is on a certain topic or treatment of a certain type of expenditure or approach. So that's one area. And then the other thing is just that because there's a very specific language and criteria for Shred, it's pretty much impossible, or it will require a large time sink for a company to invest in getting that up to speed. And then as well, when you go through an audit, if you basically don't do well in that audit, or if you kind of say the wrong things, frame the project incorrectly, or don't understand how to basically work with the CRA auditors to help them understand what your technology is about and the work that you've done, you do risk significant, a significant loss potentially to not getting your claim approved or having it significantly cut back. And so, you could save the fee that you might pay to a Shred consultant by doing it yourself, but it requires distracting your team, having a lot of investment and time to just get the Shred claim itself. But then also at the end of the day, you might, but because you're not an expert in that program, you do kind of risk losing out on the maximum refund you could get, or risk losing half of that. So what we try to do is not just take a fee to help you save that time. We do that as well to grow the size of the pie, to actually increase the expenditures you may not have known that you could have claimed, or the strategies we have in place in order to actually turn over rocks and uncover new costs. And part of that is also the interaction with grants. So to Andrea Crook's question about how IRAP and Alberta Innovates grants, how they interact with SHRED, the biggest thing is that you actually, like SHRED, despite its its reputation, it actually does play nicely with other grants. There is a general concept you can't double dip. So you can't have kind of the same expenditure being paid for by a grant and then also claim that for SHRED. But there are some nuances to that. So one example is that if you have, just to do very round numbers, let's say that you have an employee who's being paid $100,000, maybe not realistic, but we'll just use it for an example, and 80% of their salary is paid for by NRC IRAP. There is also a process in SHRED where you can claim overhead. You can elect to choose an overhead strategy that is like a multiplier on someone's wages, which allows you to claim 55% of the SHRED wages as an overhead amount. And so with a grant, you actually deduct that grant support after you've calculated for the overhead. So in this example of $100,000 of wages, and that person's 100% doing SHRED, you would also get to claim 55,000 of overhead. So in total, we're looking at 155,000 for that person. And then we take into account the NRC IRAP grant of 80,000. So at the end of the day, we take 155,000 and we subtract 80,000, and we're still left with 75,000 to claim. So it's kind of a misnomer that, or it's a common misunderstanding that like, oh, well, a lot of my staff are already covered by grants. There's not really a point to me even exploring SHRED. There's often some opportunities there that you may not have noticed at the start.
Okay, so that's actually that's kind of what I was hoping you would get at. But you did say one word multiple times that I want to bring out, because I'm actually going to pose this question to both of you. But let's start with Elliot. To be clear, when you do SHRED, you will be audited on your first time.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, they have a program called the First Time Claimant Advisory Service. And so a new claimant or a company that's entering SHRED, the SHRED system for the first time, they're going to be going down one of two tracks. So the first one is the audit review. That could be a technical audit, it could be a financial audit, or it could be a full review, which is both of those things. And that is where they ask more questions. They come out and really try to stress test what you did, what you learned, were these costs eligible to be claimed. But the alternative approach is this First Time Claimant Advisory Service. And because we love acronyms, it's FTCAS is the acronym. It is more of what we call an educational session, where CRA, they still come out and they talk to you for literally 3 hours about the program that you've already applied for. So it's kind of annoying. But in that process, they do ask questions that they really are trying to understand a bit more about your compliance, which is they're asking questions to understand per Susan's earlier comments about like what processes do you have in place, how do you guys identify a SHRED project, you just keep documentation, those types of things. They're not actually they're not calling into question this claim, but they're trying to gather information for the next year. So at the end of that FTCAS session, they will issue a letter a few weeks after, which says that your claim has been approved, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be audit free the next year. So it's them trying to understand, is this company legitimate? Are they trying to pull a fast one on us? And if they're not, then if you can make a good impression in that FTCAS, then you should be in a good spot for next year. I mean, there's always the risk of audit, but if you can make a good impression, you're on the right road. And we definitely prep and coach and are attending all those sessions, whether it's an audit, whether it's an FTCAS, because you don't want to have the CRA auditors, which this can happen. They can start to go down the road of almost treating it like a review. And we would push back on that. And we would say, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. We're talking about stuff that hasn't happened in a few months. That's not the purview of this FTCAS. So something to be aware of. You definitely will see CRA, but it's not guaranteed it'll be a full review in your first year.
Maybe second year.
And that's what we just went through at our company. We had the FTCAS, and yes, you get 3 hours on the phone with a couple of auditors at the federal government, but it's an education session. So if you look at it as that, and our CFO was on the call and he's already been educated, but he just, still nods and says thank you and is polite, and that's part of it, definitely. But as Elliot says, you are still open. They can reopen it and audit you next year if they choose to. But they offer quite a bit of really good information to help you organize and make sure you're doing it right and improve your processes, which are keeping your projects separate if you can, having a software that you use to organize everything from January 1st of the year forward rather than going back. Highly recommended. And the FDCAS program is much simpler. I haven't been audited, but only done the FDCAS, and you definitely want to do that one. So by having things in order, it's good. Another big thing that they mentioned, which I was a little bit shocked of, is a lot of times people will claim for the C-suite. They don't like that. Like the shred should usually be for just the engineering group, people who are working on research and development, maybe a little bit, but any of the founders, like stick away from claiming founders as much as possible on your shred claims. Just certain little tips that they don't like.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit of color to that too. Yeah, certainly, Susan. They want to make sure that an executive, like a CEO or president, that the majority of their time, or not majority, but like that there is some time that is spent kind of like running the business. But yeah, per Andrea's question here in the chat, that there are often startups where, you know, it's maybe 3 or 4 people and they're all founders and they're doing technical work. So I wouldn't, we would take the approach that like it is reasonable in certain contexts that you do claim for executive time, but it's rare that it's going to be like 100% of the president's time, just because like unless they just have different people that can exclusively kind of take care of running the business, but maybe that's that's more appropriate title of a CTO probably. But yeah, you definitely need to be reasonable with what percentages you claim. For speaking for our clients and our approaches, we definitely claim for founders and executive team to some percentages, but it's rare that we do like 100%. And just a small little, you know, tidbit of fact is that like if you get to 90% of someone's time, the CRA just basically rounds that up to 100%. It's called an all or substantially all, an ASA person. But yeah, it's rare to have an ASA person for a CEO or a president, because they kind of assume that there have to be other functions that president's doing. So I would definitely echo that it does. You have to have justification behind and rationale for why you're claiming whatever percentage of an executive's time. Yeah.
And just the last thing, like our first year, we didn't make a claim in 2019 because it was our founders doing it. We probably should have, because some of our experiments failed. So you don't need to be successful. Like they are completely okay with failure on your scientific and research and development. Just to remember that you can claim when you don't get the results you're looking for in the beginning as well.
So I guess I'll give you guys both this question. So in my experience, I've always treated non-dilutive capital and the parties that are providing it exactly the same as I treat dilutive capital. They are investors. They're just looking for a different outcome, right? They're covering different risks. They're looking for a different outcome. Their payback is going to be in job creation or something else. So, but that's been my approach. And so they get full access to everything from the projections to the business plans to you name it, and treat them and so forth. What have you found that's been more successful or less successful in how you work with those parties? Because I know, Susan, you said, you know, you really transition getting them from the no to the getting them more to the yes. And so what are, and you know, from Elliot's side, you're getting, how do you get the most out of shred that you could possibly get for the time that you're investing in it? Because obviously you're trying to maximize a return on investment, your time, to get the most bang for your buck. So how about we, Susan, you can start on that one. See what are your thoughts on that?
We track our time that we spend writing grants just to see which ones are successful and make sure that we should still be doing it. And now what we do, whenever a grant comes down the pipeline, we have a quick 10-minute meeting with our admin assistant who kind of runs the grant, and the key players like my head of engineering, myself, or my head of sales or business development. And within that first 15 minutes, we figure out yes or no. Like sometimes just it's no, you don't want to apply for it. It's not worth your time. And then if it's yes, we quickly like assign, and we have time limits on what time can be spent, because you can go down a rabbit hole on grants and you don't want to. Let's remember, the best money is customer money, and to drive your equity or your dilutive rounds in the future, you are going to need customer money. I've done 2 kind of pre-seeds so far and brought in over 500,000 in dilutive, but without the non-dilutive, which is over $1 million, the company wouldn't be at the spot it is with the runway to get our customer money coming in. And another key part, in addition to the non-dilutive grant funding, is the non-dilutive debt, right? So you can get non-dilutive debt right now during COVID. There's a bunch of programs that are interest-free. We've gotten one loan that's no interest for 3 years. We're applying Jobs and Growth Fund right now. Big chunk of money that you can, and I think there's an equivalent in Alberta as well that you can apply for. The very short answer on Jobs and Growth is whatever you have in your bank account, you can potentially get matched as a debt. Like it's debt, but you don't have any interest in the payback. It's not for 9 years to pay the whole loan back. So why would you go and give a percentage of your company away if you could get some debt financing to do the same thing? So, and the manufacturing loans, once you've got contracts for sales, you can go get manufacturing debt loans. So you need to look at the same as you do a IP strategy. You have to have a financing strategy of what percentages you want to bring in from where, and then explore the programs that have the best, because there's lots of people who will give you debt financing and charge you 15%. So if you can go get debt and not have any interest on it for 3 years, that's the way you want to go. So it's exploring all those options.
Okay. Elliot?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's great perspective, Susan. Yeah, I'd say that in terms of ROI, it's just with you just have to look at where you spend your time. So for one of our clients who works with us now, before they start working with us, they'd have their entire engineering team. We're talking like a firm of about 100 to 200 people. For their entire engineering division, they would basically dedicate the entire month of December for them to have their engineers write up their shred applications. And so when you put that in the context of a larger business, it's like, what are you giving up by having your entire staff distracted doing something that takes them probably a lot longer than it would, for someone who's a specialist and stuff. So yeah, it's just a question of ROI and where your time is spent, whether it's getting your product to market, which is, as Susan mentioned, it's like that's your road to success. That's the end goal, and Shred is just a way to support that. And it's just a matter of deciding what the best route is for you to do that. Yeah, I'll probably just leave it there. That's probably the most succinct answer I've given so far.
I'm just going to answer Andrea's question. Great question, Andrea, in the chat. Isn't the Jobs and Growth Fund limited by other federal grants? And the answer is yes. But my experience to date is that almost all the grants that I can get cover people. It doesn't cover my rent, doesn't cover my COGS, it doesn't cover my manufacturing. So I find there's a big chunk that I can still get covered by a debt financing if the business is manufacturing a product, or there's always other expenses. 90% of the grants only cover people. It's very difficult to find money to cover things or other COGS that you have to purchase.
So, but a lot of these grants do require dilutive capital to be in, because there's a matching component. So do you guys want to talk about that aspect? Because if you become too focused on spending your time on the non-dilutive, then there you can risk become tainted that, well, you're not actually able to raise equity money, and there's an equity component that's needed in a lot of these grants. So thoughts on how do you manage the balancing act that takes place between dilutive and non-dilutive?
You spend a lot of sleepless nights. But it's something different each week that keeps you up at night. Elliot makes a good point. Sometimes you shift off some of the grants because it does take time. So you have to be thinking about that balance. And I would say at any time we're probably 25% debt, 50% grants, and 25% equity is what our kind of focus is. And then we're just selling now. So we're just shifting from what I call a science project to being a real company as we start our commercialization and our sales. And to get into any big money, like if you want to raise more than $1 million in dilutive, you need 4 to 6 months of monthly recurring revenue to do that. So you can't let that go. That is the most important part. It's becoming a business, not a project.
Yeah, and I'll just add into that as well that like for a lot of companies, they kind of think of it as this binary thing of like you're either doing science and then you commercialize and you're not anymore. And I think an important aspect to consider it just is to frame the idea that like the SHRED program and other grants as well, they do cover for things like incremental improvements. And for a lot of our, like, you know, we've got clients we've worked with for 17 years where it's not like they've just been doing R&D exclusively for 17 years. There's aspects of like developing a product, rolling it out, and then making improvements to that, or developing a new product line. So I think it's absolutely important for long-term sustainability of your company to ensure that you do have you know, actual demand in the marketplace for your product, and you're actually developing something that people are wanting and buying. And then you can also just use some of that money to expand your upfront development to develop more product lines or improvements to get even better market penetration or expansion. And just as an additional comment to something you mentioned earlier, Susan, about a lot of those grants are really good for covering people. And in case it wasn't already evident from our previous comments, that SHRED does cover for people as well. It covers for the labor aspect as well as contractors. But another aspect, which is sometimes overlooked, is the fact that it does cover for materials. And I'll just do a very quick comment on what that means. That can include materials that are consumed in the process of doing experimentation and development and testing, or it can also include things that go into an actual prototype where you're developing a demonstration unit to actually test out your hypothesis, your theory, your technology. And there's a lot of nuance, and it gets relatively complicated and kind of expensive as you kind of go along that TRL trajectory, and you're developing more and more units. And the question is like, there's more gray area about like, what are the units that we can claim? At what point have we actually gathered enough data that we've proven our technology or hypothesis? And so those larger dollar items are actually they can sometimes be higher risk, and that's a lot more complicated, but it's also potentially much more valuable if you can claim like a $50,000 unit as a prototype. And there's a lot of ramifications for that. So definitely as you kind of enter that territory, it becomes really important to have a good understanding, a good grasp of how CRA looks at that.
Well, and that's an important part, because others like IRAP do look at equipment and things that are that can help you as well. So like there's no just one way of skinning this cat. There you have to take a look at those different programs and what is it you're actually trying to achieve. Susan, have you ever worked with outside parties to help you in this process of managing all of these, or do you do it internal? And if you've done that, what has been your thought process in doing that?
Yes, we haven't, and that's simply because of my legal background and ability to do technical writing, and then my team's ability to do technical writing. But in hindsight, like, we also are a plant, and I haven't applied for any of the agricultural grants because we aren't an edible. We're just a genetically bioengineered plant. But I think a good strategy, I don't know if even right now, if there's some grants that you don't have time to apply for, like those agricultural, then you could hire a firm, and they, I think, usually take around 10% of the grant, but I don't think they're allowed to do it that way. I'm not exactly sure how they work, but there's a way that they, in the end, I think, get about 10%. But for things that you just don't have time to do, why not give it to them to write for you? And then ask around, like these type of calls and fireside chats are really important, because there's other grants. For instance, the NRC ISC grants. Those are the challenges that the NRC puts out a few times a year. They just put one out that was almost perfectly written for us for HVAC ventilation in buildings. So actually this touches onto a few things. 75% of McGill, for instance, has no HVAC, no mechanical HVAC in their buildings. They need a way to clean the indoor air. but they also want a way to clean COVID out of the air. So we're developing a UVC right now, and we've patented 6 months ago a UVC filter, but there's so many hoops you need to jump through. So you have to be playing all of these things at the same time. So this grant came out at the perfect time for us because they want a TRL 4 to 6 company in development, and it's 150,000 to finish the development. And then there's another grant that can come on to develop it and commercialize it. And then at the end of the line, the beauty of these ISC grants, there's contracts, like real government contracts, real sales, and that's what your goal is. But what I can say about these ones, because we in January missed one by the website crashing, and I'm not kidding, this was probably collected from my team a couple hundred hours of work, and then the website crashed half an hour before we submitted, and they refused to let us submit. So get them in early. Like, I've also heard they don't wait to start reviewing people. So get the ISC grants in. Like, we submitted, this one's due December 23rd. We submitted on Friday. So get them in early. Don't wait till the deadline. That is a huge tip that I didn't know in the beginning. That's really important for some grants, not all. There's also really good, like, I've done a lot of pitch events, and as a hardware product, I don't necessarily think that I'm going to be the winner because I'm competing against SaaS companies that have lower valuations that new investors like, but it's really good for publicity, for getting your name out there. I would highly recommend doing some of those events as well.
Who let the dogs out?
Yes, surprise cameos.
See, she's in agreement with you. It's like, so, well, she goes and does her thing. You know, it's been interesting. COVID has allowed us to actually see all sorts of other sides of the of what we have to deal with. So, you know, in this process of grant writing, now obviously you know, Susan, you tweaked on something in my mind that obviously this is a key component for you as a CEO. You're actually prepared to take the time, so you're allocating limited resources for this process.
Yes,
super important. What I'd like to see is, like, Elliot, like, I know from our side, we've elected to actually subcontract out this, and we work with you guys. So I'm not trying to plug you, but I guess I am plugging you. Like, we work with you because we don't actually, the amount of time that it takes to do this, as opposed to working on other things, is just, it's a cost benefit analysis, and you can handle it and do it. It's helped us so that, you know, when it comes to the audit time, because you eventually will get audited on this, I would imagine, at some point.
Yeah,
and
it's
sorry,
probably,
to be clear, our shred, we do all of our recording of time and recording of projects, but we do give it to a professional to look over, make any changes, and to file on our behalf. On shred especially, I completely agree with you. You need someone who does this to look at it.
yeah, and just, yeah, to add to that, James, yeah, for sure, like, there is probably a sizable chance that you will get. I don't know, Siri doesn't, they're not transparent, or they don't publish what their actual cadence of, like, when they would interview, sorry, when they would audit someone. I think that more recently, a company we've been working with for, I think, 8 years, they had not been audited, and they started claiming before Siri had rolled out that FTCAS educational session as a policy, which I believe was in 2015 or thereabouts. And yeah, they've just been audited for the first time this year. So eventually you do kind of get audited, for sure. And yeah, for sure, absolutely. Our reason for being as a company is that we want to make sure that companies are getting back as much as they can. And then from a time perspective, our rule of thumb is that for a first-time claimant with us, it's approximately between 4 and 8 hours of the client's time per fiscal year in order for us to gather all of the information we need on the technical side, as well as the financial side, as well as to obviously file it and submit that claim. So it's you know, we're really trying to save many hours or dozens of hours from the client trying to muddle their way through and try to figure out for themselves for the first time. But yeah, it absolutely does come down to a cost benefit, just evaluation of where an executive or their prized technical teams and financial people want to be spending their time, for sure.
Okay, because we have just under 10 minutes. So one of the things I want to do is throw it out there. Anybody that's got questions, please throw them out here. Use a Q&A or chat, whatever. We prefer the Q&A because we can actually type it back to you if you'd like, but whatever, we'll answer your questions. Waiting for others. What I was gonna, I want to ask a really open-ended question here as far as what have you guys seen as been the biggest fundamental mistakes that you could ever make? Like, I know Susan already answered that. You don't go to certain parties before others. Okay.
Yes.
Are there other fatal errors that we want to make sure our audience just totally avoids, don't step in it? Thoughts on that?
I think a fatal error is not going for as much non-dilutive as you can if you outsource it or do it in-house, because especially if you're a hardware company, your time to market is going to be longer than you think, especially when there's a pandemic going on. So like we started our company in mid 2019. Our pilot project was supposed to be done in April of 2020. COVID hit. So without the non-dilutive, you need that to get to the next level, and there's lots of it available. So I think going for the non-dilutive, but also knowing the real costs, knowing what you need. So there's great DS4Y grants out there that cover 100% of an employee, but they're under 30. So there's a trade-off when you're going with employees under 30. There's a large turnover rate. So you have to be aware of all these kind of pieces that fit together. But if you put it in order, like our first NRC IRAP grants were youth employment programs. So again, under 30 or under 31. Great stepping stones, but by putting all those stepping stones in place, this September, I was able to hire a PhD, a master's chemical engineer. I was like, I want people with gray hair. I want a couple gray-haired individuals, put that out there. And then finally, I was given the ability to hire some more senior people who aren't going to be there just for a co-op semester or for 6 months grant and then moving on to another company. So putting all the pieces together and just knowing which grants to apply for at what time and becoming familiar with that. But at the same time, the most important thing is getting your product to market as fast as you can, because the grants will only last so long and you need to get that product into market to start making real revenue.
Yeah, no, those are great comments, Susan. Yeah, I'd add that along the same lines of just of knowing what's out there, I think a fatal flaw that I've observed is sometimes talking with some clients who basically push off claiming shred because they just don't have time. And it's like it's not so much of a time investment to outsource that fully. And so I've seen companies who I've tried to talk with for a couple of years in a row, and by the time that the third year comes around, like looking back and understanding what they had on the table, how many teams on their R&D team that they were working on. Like some of these companies I'm talking about had the word research in their company name. And they were losing out on approximately between $100,000 and $500,000 a year, and just because they were too busy to look at it. So I would say that it's valuable to just have a conversation and like figure out what is the actual cost benefit here. Like, are you too busy for that? Because it really could make a difference for you to take that money and reinvest in hiring more people if you are that busy, for example. And then another thing, just as it's a less interesting comment, but just that capital and equipment, including rentals, are not allowed for shred. So that's a big no-no. I'll just say that if anyone is self-preparing, that you definitely want to make sure you're not putting any claims for the rental of equipment. Is a big focus area that Surrey has been zeroing in on a number of recent audits we've observed.
We do have some questions in the list. So Susan, you can actually address one of them, which is, do you have a full-time grant writer? Is there a list to where all of this non-dilutive capital all the different sources. Or do you guys know of such a list?
Well, I know I have a list. I'm happy to share like a list of this with people. Maybe I can put one together for Foresight. I'm sure Foresight probably has one, but maybe I can just give a bit of a list because it is a lot to sort through and a lot to figure out. And as startup founders, I'm sure we all need a little bit of help. So I'm more than happy to share my list. I can answer all of these actually. I don't have a full-time grant writer, but I would say the equivalent of one full-time person. We just share there's about 4 of us because grants require the engineers to write some of the answers, the biz dev people to write some of the answers. We have what we call a frequently asked questions form that we update with all of our grants because you're iterating all the time, just like your pitch decks, right? Like I've made at least 250 pitch decks in the last 2.5 years. Like it's just something that happens. You take those and you always update your FAQ so your staff can take it and plug it into your grants. Trade Commission. This is a loaded question. The Trade Commission is incredible on all access to other places. Highly, highly recommend them. The grants, the Can Export Innovation Grant, very difficult. That's the pre-revenue grant. You can get up to 75,000. It's very onerous. If I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't do this. I have given them that feedback because it's way too difficult. But once you have made over 75,000, it's very easy to get grants to go to the US, to go to other countries. So again, get that revenue so you can access the easier grants.
Okay. I know we're running towards the end, so I think what we can do is thank you, Susan, so much for that. It was hugely helpful. And Elliot, much appreciated. Maybe you guys can share contact information if you'd like with our audience. They might want to have a chat with you guys independently. But I want to say thank you for that. There is a feedback form at the bottom of that Tyler has shared with everybody. If you guys could take that and fill it out, it does help us as we advance on this. Our next Fireside Chat is going to be coming up in January, and our topic is actually going to be on corporate governance. So it's something that is actually relevant to everybody. Make sure you sign up and or get that into your calendars. And I'm going to thank you, Susan. Thank you, Elliot. I'm going to turn it over to Tyler, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Hope everybody has a great holiday season, and we'll see you guys next year. Tyler.
Thank you. Thanks so much, James.
Awesome. And yeah, thank you, James. And I'm going to echo your sentiment, Susan and Elliot. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving your time, and all this knowledge I think has been super valuable. Everyone, as you can see, their contact information is in the chat there, but I will be following up afterwards, and so if anyone needs to make any connections, happy to do so. Just some final notes, because I know it's 11 o'clock out west, but just a reminder to everyone that our program registrations are still open. If you know any organizations that want to go through the acceleration program, it is still open, and you can find all that information on the website. And one final note, Foresight will be closing from December 18th to January 3rd. So this is last week to get in anything you need. So feel free to reach out to all of us, and have yourselves a very happy holiday season if we don't hear from you. So thanks again, everyone. And thanks for a fantastic 2021. It's been fantastic.
Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.